What are some of the first things that come to mind when you hear those statements? The restoration of God's people, the restoration of Israel, the restoration of the Jews. What are some of the first things that come to mind when you hear those particular statements being made? I want to get you all's perspective. I don't want to assume or presume anything. I want to hear you all's perspectives based on those particular statements that I just made. What are some of the first images and some of the first things that come to mind when you hear those terms? Someone said prophecy. J2 to Bruce said prophecy. Yah 1247 says Yasha Allah is rising. All right. Sister Chabasa or Chabasha says coming back to the law. We got Zakar Shabath who says the remnant. Barbara Lindsay says reconciliation. Sister Cheryl says returning back. Okay, so based on your responses, you all are not under, let me call it the trance that the whole world is under in regards to those particular statements. Because what you all are saying is it's in line with biblical prophecy. It's in line with what we understand when it comes to the restoration of God's people according to the Bible. But if I were to ask that same question to the general population, I would probably get a response such as this. Check this out. If I were to say the restoration of Israel, the restoration of the Jews, or the restoration of God's people, this is probably the first thing that comes into the minds of the majority of the population. Let me make sure I put this up 1 second. Let's make sure we get that into the footage. All right, so check this out. Fair use for educational purposes only.
Blamed on British tear gas, but examination showed it was accidentally crushed and suffocated on the overcrowded ship. All precautions are taken to prevent the spread of disease as small children debark along with fathers and mothers, all showing the signs of fatigue and illness.
And I'm pretty sure some of you have seen, if not all of you, have seen some of these pictures, some of these news reports, either in documentaries or what have you, pertaining to what? The restoration of Israel. Right? To be more specific, the restoration of the state of Israel in 1948. Right? This is usually what comes to mind, especially if you are inquiring or asking the general population what they understand or what they believe concerning the restoration of Israel. Right? Let's go on.
The British encounter little trouble transferring the refugees. Mostly the procedure is carried out in an orderly manner as embarkation for Cyprus detention camps takes place. Cyprus, already bursting with refugees, is preferable to deportation to Europe as had been threatened. At Lake Success, New York, the United Nations gives Palestine's problems first consideration. Herschel Johnson, U.S. delegate, backs partition in a message to the Assembly's Special Palestine Committee.
So let's hear that again one more time. Let's go back a little bit.
Is preferable to deportation to Europe as had been threatened. At Lake Success, New York, the United Nations gives Palestine's problems first consideration.
So it says the United Nations gives Palestine's problems the first consideration. Right? This is at the UN building.
Herschel Johnson, U.S. delegate, backs partition in a message to the Assembly's Special Palestine Committee.
The United States delegation supports the basic principles of the unanimous recommendations and the majority plan which provides for partition and immigration. We refer to assistance through the United Nations in meeting economic and financial problems and the problem of internal law and order during the transition period. The latter problem might require the establishment of a special constabulary or police force recruited on a volunteer basis by the United Nations.
Later, Russia supported the United States on the partition recommendation, while Arab states threatened reprisals, as the Holy Land's future hangs in the balance.
And when they speak about the partition, you're going to hear about that a bit later when we get through some more footage, some more videos. You're going to hear about this partition of the land of Israel, what many of you may have heard of in relatively recent times as a two-state solution, right? But we'll touch on that a bit later. But this is usually what comes to mind when you hear about, or when the conversation comes up concerning the restoration of God's people or the restoration of Israel, right? Do you all agree, Khan? Do you all agree? Or for some of you, maybe this is your first time ever hearing things from this perspective. This is your first time ever hearing about the restoration of Jewish people in 1948 or what have you. This is your first time seeing this type of footage. Give me some feedback. Let me all know. Let me know what you all are thinking in concern of this or in regards to this. Okay, Khan. So for the most part, you all agree that that's the first thing that comes to mind, right? And then obviously we have to talk about if there's a restoration of God's people, or if there was a restoration of God's people in 1948, what in specific were they being restored from? Well, according to what we understand, let's pull up another video. This is what we understand concerning what these people in particular were being restored from. Okay. Wow. Who's that? Andre Sheely says he's seen them back in the 70s. So they've been showing us these images for a long time. Right? We've been hearing the story for a long time. Right? The return of God's people, the restoration of the Jews. Right? So what were they being restored from? What was all of what you just seen? What was that all about? Why was it necessary for these people to be restored or returned? And I'm using the term restored loosely, right? Because we're going to get into the biblical understanding of what restoration looks like for God's people. But again, just dealing with this from the media's narrative. Just dealing with this from the narrative of secular history. When we're talking about the restoration, we're talking about the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel in 1948. Okay? So what were they returning from according to secular history? Let's see. Again, fair use for educational purposes only.
The Geiringer family had been rounded up earlier by the Gestapo and deported to Auschwitz as well.
And let me know, can you all hear the videos nice and clearly when the videos are being played? When I play the videos, can you all hear them nice and clearly? All right, I'm going to play it a little bit more. Y'all let me know if y'all can hear these loud and clear. If not, I'll try to make some adjustments. Sister Benita Rodriguez says, Holocaust. I've been learning or hearing about this since the 1970s in junior high school. So again, we have a testimony of someone who was in school since the 70s stating that they've been hearing this particular story for a long time. Okay? And right now, we're not making any presumptions. We're not making any assumptions. We're just going according to the narrative, right? So let's jump back in. The videos are fine. Let's jump back in. Just a little, someone says just a little low on the volume. Let me see if I can make a quick adjustment on the video. All right, one moment.
The Nazis never told you anything, so we had no idea where we were going, what was going to happen to us. And there were some work camps, but we were lucky we were sent to Auschwitz and not to Treblinka, for instance, where the whole transport, no selection, whole transport went into the gas chambers. So
fair use for educational purposes only.
At least we had a chance. But the first terrible thing was, at arrival, men and women to different sides. That was the first command. And you can imagine what scene that was. Because people thought, and it did happen, of course, many times, that people never ever saw each other on Earth.
Now, keep in mind that all of this that we're seeing, let's keep in mind that none of this is taking place in the Middle East. It's not taking place in Iraq. It's not taking place in Iran. It's not taking place in the land of Israel. This is not going on in Syria. Everything that we're seeing and witnessing, according to this video, is taking place in Europe. Okay? To be specific, places such as Germany, Poland, so on and so forth. None of this is taking place in what is called today, or what is known as today, the Middle East.
So my mother and father embraced, and Heinz and my mother and my father and me. And my father, that is something which I remember very clearly. He took me by the hands and he said, Evertje, that's a Dutch name for Evertje, God will protect you. And that was amazed. I was amazed at that, because he was not really religious. But at that moment, he realized nobody else could do it, but if there is a God, he will look after me. Yeah, and then the man...
All right, so we're not going to play the whole thing, but this is pretty much, from what we understand and what we were told, what they were being redeemed from, or what they were being restored from. Okay? So, here's the next question. Because the same time we have a narrative of this particular people making a proclamation to the world that not only that they are the children or the chosen people of God, but also that because they went through an atrocity in Europe, that in due time, God restored them to their rightful place in the earth, which is in the land of Palestine. And you know what? If they are, in fact, the Jews that the Bible speaks of, then absolutely, they belong in the land of Palestine, because Palestine, or what we call Palestine, or the land of Israel, that is the land that was promised to the people of God. But now here's the issue. At the same time that they're making a proclamation to being the children of God who have been restored after going through an atrocity, after going through an Holocaust. On the other hand, you have another group of people making very similar claims. that not only are they God's chosen people, but that they also went through atrocities, that they also went through a Holocaust, that they've also gone through genocide, and that because they went through these things, not only should they receive justice, but that eventually they also will be restored as God's people in the earth. They also would be restored as the rightful heirs of God's covenant, and a part of that covenant contains what, or involves what? The restoration to the land of Palestine or Israel. Right? So now check this out. What do I mean by this? At the same time, you have people looking at this as a restoration. Check this out.
Two former American vessels carrying nearly 4,000 Jewish refugees arrive at the port of Haifa, Palestine, jammed like cattle on the rustic craft.
The same time you would see this, or the world would see this as a restoration of God's people. On the other side, and this is just an example, this is a small example, but an example nonetheless. You have people who would see this as a restoration of God's people. And I'm not going to play the sound. I'm just going to skip through it a little bit just to give some context to this. If this can be seen as a restoration of God's people, why can't this? And that's just a question. Okay, we're just skipping through. Okay. There you see the elders, several bishops and leaders throughout the four corners of the earth. Okay. All right. There we see the play. Okay. That we tend to do every Passover. There you see the children. Okay. So why isn't this seen as a restoration on par with this?
The fugitives end their bleak voyage, which began at a Black Sea port. The death of an infant was first blamed on British tear gas, but examination showed it was accidentally crushed and suffocated on.
Why aren't these both seen on the same exact level? Okay. Now, before we get into that, let's actually go into the Bible, and we're going to discuss historically from the biblical perspective why there was a need for God's people to be restored in the first place. Okay, we're going to take some time to go through a little bit of biblical history to show why God's people needed to be restored in the first place. What happened in Israel's history? And again, I'm not making any presumptions of who's what, who's who. I'm just putting it out there. Why would God's people need to be restored in the first place? Because after all, if these people, whoever they are, if these people are in fact God's people, shouldn't they have always held a position of influence? Shouldn't they have always been in a state of God's grace? Shouldn't they have always been in a position of power and having the respect and the authority of God's people on earth throughout all ages? Shouldn't that be the case for a people who claims to, after all, be God's people? Well, let's see. And we're going to come back to the videos a bit later, but let's go into some Bible history to show why God's people would need to be restored in the first place. All right, let me adjust this one moment. We're going to start off in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 27, verse number 1. All right, Deuteronomy 27 and 1. I want you all to follow along with me. Deuteronomy 27 and 1 says, "And Moses with the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I command you this day." So everything we're about to read in concern or in regards of the children of God, their rightful position, but then also the position they would take due to disobedience. All of this is pertaining to what the Bible calls, or who the Bible refers to as, the children of Israel. God is not speaking to Chinese people. He's not speaking to Japanese people. He's not speaking to Germans. He's not speaking to Arabs. He is specifically speaking to the children of Israel. So let's see what God has to say about the Israelites and their rightful position. Deuteronomy 28 and 1 is going to show us what God says about the rightful position of the Israelites. Deuteronomy 28 and 1 says, "And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all the nations of the earth." So this was supposed to be the rightful position of who? The Israelites. This is, after all, who God is speaking to. We established that in Deuteronomy 27 and 1. So it says that if the Israelites were to keep God's commandments and to observe everything that he commanded them, that they would be placed on high above all nations of the earth. This was supposed to be the rightful position of the Israelites. This was supposed to be the rightful position of God's people. This was supposed to be the rightful position of the Jews. But something happened. Let's jump down to verse number 15. And now let's discuss what would happen if the Israelites, if the Jews, if God's people did the opposite of what God commanded. "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." So, with obedience comes blessings. With obedience comes authority. Over who? Over all the nations of the earth that God had created. If the Israelites obeyed, they would receive authority over these nations. Right? But now what came with the opposite of obedience, which is disobedience? Well, with disobedience came curses. So now the question is, what are some of the curses that will befall the Israelites for their disobedience? Let's jump down to verse number 29, where it says, "And thou shalt grope at noonday, as the blind gropeth in darkness, and shalt not prosper in thy ways." So the Israelites, on large, would not be prosperous, would not find prosperity. Check this out. Here's the key point. "Thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore." So we understand that according to Deuteronomy 28, one of the curses that would befall the Israelites for their disobedience would be what? Continual oppression. The Israelites would be continually, perpetually oppressed. It goes on to say, "And no man shall save thee." No man would be able to save thee from this oppression. No man would be able to restore you from this oppression. We're going to come back to this a little bit later, right? We're going to come to this a little later because it's going to fare prominent and important. It's going to hold some value as we go through some of these videos. And we get into the history of how the restoration of the Jews took place in 1948. Okay, we're going to see if this holds true for others who may refer to themselves as God's people, right? But reading on, it says here, "Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build an house, and shall not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and shall not gather the grapes thereof." Okay, which means what? The labor of the Israelites would be exploited. The Israelites would find themselves in a place or in a position in which they would build houses, but would not dwell in those houses. Right? Meaning they would build an abode, build a place to live, but they themselves would not reap the benefit of what they built. Right? It says, "They should plant a vineyard and shall not gather the grapes thereof." So they would not be able to benefit from their own labor. Their labor would be exploited. It also states what? That you shall betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. So not only would their labor be exploited, their women would be exploited. Okay? Their women would be largely exploited. All right, moving on. Verse number 32, it says, "Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people. Thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand." Okay, so what are we seeing? We're seeing a prophecy in which the Israelites, or the Jews, we're going to use the term Jews prominently. Let's use that term instead. Israelites, that sounds very foreign when we say Israelite, right? People think that that's something that just popped onto the scene with the advent of the internet. When in reality, the term Israelite is all throughout the Bible. But when you say Jews, for people, that's a little bit more safe. They can relate to the term Jews. So we're going to use the term Jews instead of Israelites as we go through this. Even though Israelite is in the Bible, we're going to use Jews, right? And when I say Jews, I'm speaking about the nation of Israel as a whole, right? We're not going to be technical tonight with the use of the term Jews. So 32 says that the sons and the daughters of the Jews shall be given unto another people, and that their eyes shall look and fell with longing all the day long. So you would see an instance, an event in history would take place in which the children of the Jews would be snatched from their possession, right? And they would have absolutely no power to restore those children, to bring those children back into their possession, right? So now you're understanding why the Jews would need to be restored. Why? Because according to the Bible, the Jews would be oppressed. The Jews would become the lowest thing on this side of the earth. So they would need to be what? Restored from their oppressed position, from their low estate. Right? So that's what this is explaining in Deuteronomy. So now, again, we're going to jump around just to get a few of these prophecies. All right, Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse number 34. So that thou shalt be mad for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. So because you're going through oppression, because you're being exploited, because your women are being exploited, because your children are being exploited, what will happen? You will become mad. Many of you would be driven to insanity, complete and utter insanity for what you have had to endure and what you have had to witness based on your state of oppression. Now, what brought on the state of oppression? What brought on the state of exploitation? Well, again, it goes back to verse number 15. Disobedience is what started the cause and effect. Disobedience is what caused the chain reaction. Right? So, getting back to a few more of these examples out of Deuteronomy of things that would befall the Jews and why they would need to be restored. Let's go to verse number 37. And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. So everywhere you go, you will become a proverb, a byword, an astonishment. Okay? Every nation would have a slur by which they would, by which they would use to refer to you as a people. Okay? So what is this showing you? There will come a time in which the Jews, God's people, would no longer be known as the Jews. They will be known by several slurs, several epithets. Okay? Now, I'm going to leave you all to draw your conclusion. Again, I don't want to make any presumptions. And by me putting forth some of those particular slurs, that would be me making a presumption and assumption. And I don't want to do that tonight. You all draw the conclusions of some of the slurs that you believe would be used against God's people, the Jews. Okay? Well, some people are saying the N-word, which leads me to believe that you all have come to the conclusion that the people that are being spoken of in this chapter are what the world identifies as so-called black people, so-called African Americans, or what have you. Okay? And if that's the case, then the N-word that's just the top of the iceberg. Okay. How about spook? How about moonshine? How about porch monkey? How about pickaninny? How about gator bait? Okay. So on and so forth. It goes on. How about coon? Okay. Those sound like some bywords, and those sound like bywords to me. Right? But that's if you were to identify these people as the Jews. Someone said tar baby. Okay. Gollywag. Okay. So on and so forth. Okay. Uncle. Annie. Okay. Aunt your mama. What's the name they had? Uncle, not just Uncle Tom. There was another one they had. Okay. I want to say Uncle Ruckus, but I know that's the Boondocks. That's not the one. There was another one they had, like Uncle Remus or something like that. Okay. Uncles and aunties. Why they call us uncles and aunties? Well, when the oppressor, when he had children, those children, even though you could have a 6-year-old boy, right, who in reality is supposed to respect. The Bible says you're supposed to respect your elders. Okay, regardless of the nationality or the race or the ethnicity of the people you're dealing with, you know, there still should be some respect to the aged. Okay, and we all have that basically as a common understanding, that regardless of what you may feel about a people or what have you, you still to some degree respect the aged of any people, right? Well, they said, well, okay, instead of our children referring to an elderly black woman as ma'am or miss or Mrs., which are terms of respect, and referring to a black man as Mr., right? Which Mr., when you get into those terms, Mr., those go back to terms like maester or master, right? Instead of giving them that respect, they would call them what? Uncle, auntie, right? Which is acknowledging that these are older people in age, but, you know, you don't give them respect of a Mr. or a Mrs. Okay? Boy. Okay? Jungle bunnies, all kinds of stuff that, all kinds of things that we were called, right? Gal. Right? Y'all bringing some stuff out the woodworks. My Lord. Okay, mammy. Okay. Right. Okay. So those are bywords, right? But moving on, we don't want to harp here. We still got a lot to cover. All right, 43. It says, the stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou be destroyed. Because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded thee. Now check this out. I'm going to come back to that, but some would make the argument that, well, other people were also called by epithets, bywords, slurs, right? If you want to look at the Jewish people, right? There's certain terms and certain slurs that were used to label and demean them as well. But here's the difference. If you use those terms, you will find yourself in a world of hurt. Why? It just so happens that they have the power and the ability to castigate, to judge, and to penalize anyone who uses those particular terms that they deem hurtful and harmful to their people. So you can't even say the terms. You can barely say the term Jew without being castigated, without being ostracized. Right? Because they have the ability to do what? To penalize and judge you to the highest extent of the law. And even with that, they're talking about taking it to another level. Okay? We've seen examples of bank accounts being frozen. Right? We've seen examples of people losing their livelihood. All kinds of things have happened behind people using terms which are deemed harmful to that particular group of people. But the Bible says that what? We read earlier. Okay, at least I believe we read earlier. It may be coming later. That the Jews, according to the curses of Deuteronomy, the power would not be in their hands to protect themselves to that extent. They would not have the ability or the authority to penalize any and everyone that uses certain terms against them. Okay? Which shows a contrast, which leads to other questions. And I'll let you decide what those questions are. If you got two groups of people making these claims of who they are according to the Bible, one has the ability to protect themselves. The other doesn't have the ability to protect themselves. One has the ability to penalize anyone who they deem as either a threat or anyone who speaks ill upon their name. The other doesn't have that power. Not only does he not have that power, anytime he makes some type of claim or suggestion that someone should be penalized for the disrespect of their race, they're told they need to get over it. They're told it's just words. They're told they're just being sensitive. You people are just sensitive about everything. Always complaining. Right? So now that would beg the question, who fits these curses that we're reading?
The Bible. Is it hard to understand?
When it comes to reading the Bible, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that this is the Word of God.
The seals have been broken, and the truth is here.
And when we go throughout the scriptures, when we go throughout extra biblical records, we find that the language that God employed, that he used to create the heavens and the earth, was the Hebrew language.
Christ said, I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But yet no one, no religious leader, no religious church out there anywhere can now identify the 12 tribes of Israel. Can we? God is quite simple, but it seems as if man makes understanding him hard.
What are those mysteries?
The truth of your book and the truth will make you free. The Hebrew and Bible Academy, you're invited.